Welcome students to your second last week of lectures. Last week in chapter 11 and in week 11 we covered trade policy but looking at from the perspective of imperfect competition. This week we're moving to chapter 12 into international trade organizations. So this is a lot less in terms of theory, it's more of a historical look and looking at the relationships between countries. Some of the key things that we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at multilateral international trade organizations. We're going to look at the idea that international cooperation and rules is better for international trade. And we're going to look at that from the perspective of how bad bigger than neighbor policies were. Bigger than neighbor policies are trade policies that when implemented negatively affects another country. And we're going to look at a couple of organizations. We're going to look at the World Trade Organization, which was previously known as GATT. We're going to look at the UN and the UNCTAD. We're going to look at what global coverage they have. And we're going to look at OECD countries, or we're going to look at least that organization, which is usually seen as the rich man's club. And then we're going to look at the idea that economic transitions are multifaceted and leads to international decline of production. So we're going to look at the idea of Big Bang versus gradualism, and we're going to look at those terms when we cover them a bit later. What we find here is that we're looking at the imports of the USA over a period from 1929 to 1933, and they color coordinated. And we find that the imports decreased from 1929 to 1933. Here we can see that the green arrows are representing the 1929 years. Then each color that comes afterwards, if you follow the web which is coming towards the center, then it represents the year that follows. Important thing that you should know that is from 1929 to 1933 that the US imports became a third of what it was in 1929. In 1929, it was just under 3 billion, and in 1933, it was just under 1 billion. So this is what has happened in the period near the Great Depression. Unfortunately, what we've seen with the USA was not alone for them in that period of time. These bigger than nation policies affected a lot more other countries. So what had to occur was the idea that, okay, we form an organization which is located in Geneva, and then we're going to have some key policies that we're going to have in place, or some key principles that we need to stick to. And the first key prospect or the key principle that existed for GATT and for World Trade Organization is the idea of non-discrimination. So all members have to apply to non-discrimination. What they're saying in terms of non-discrimination is the idea that if I allow for some trade concession for another country, means my country needs to allow for that same trade concession for all other members that belong to the World Trade Organization. So if I decide I'm going to drop my tariffs as South Africa for Zimbabwe, and automatically every other country that is part of the World Trade Organization, I need to then also drop my tariffs to that same rate that I'm giving Zimbabwe. At the same time, also non-discrimination is in terms of products. All products are treated equally, whether they are foreign products or your own national products. They are treated the same. The only discrimination that occurs in foreign products is what the trade restriction is doing to the product. That's it. Beyond that, the process of treating products is exactly the same. There are exceptions to this rule, and the first exception is if you belong to a free trade area or custom union, then the non-discrimination does not need to apply to you. Why? The idea is if you belong to a free trade area and custom union, then you're already moving forward in terms of having free trade. You're doing something that's positive in terms of trade. Also, if you're a developing country, then non-discrimination does not also apply for you. Reciprocity. Reciprocity is the idea that if I have a concession, if I've set up a concession, a trade concession against another country, like I'm doing something really good for this country, I'm deciding I'm going to drop my tariffs, then at the same time, all other countries must do the same for me. It's like I do you a favor, you do me a favor. So that is what reciprocity is about. Allowing my trade concession to come back towards me. So that's a good thing. That is what they're trying to do in terms of World Trade Organization. It's not supposed to just be a one-sided thing. We're trying to engage two countries together or multiple countries together to have good relationships in terms of trade. And then the last principle is about prohibition on trade restrictions other than tariffs. This idea that in terms of a trade restriction, we're saying, okay, let's only use tariffs. One type of trade restriction by every country across the world. Let's not try to use quotas. Let's not try to use subsidies. Certain things, certain of those trade restrictions are then kind of banned. And that's the kind of the idea that we're trying to get to. Just trying to use one thing. And at the moment, as it is tariffs that is the main form of prohibition that's being allowed under the World Trade Organization, although the idea of tariffs over time is to abolish them, or to totally remove them in terms of the relationships that you have with countries. Remember, we're trying to move towards free trade. And yes, tariffs are allowed, and they're mostly allowed for by developing countries. Or if you allow for tariff to decrease, then you must apply to every other country except for the exceptions that we have mentioned above. The World Trade Organization membership has increased over time. Over a period of more than 15 years, we find that the amount of members has increased quite substantially. We actually had more than 20 odd members join during this time. That's important. We're finding that more and more of the countries that exist in the world are becoming members of the World Trade Organization. And that makes it easy. If majority of countries are part of this organization, then trading can be facilitated a lot more easier because there's rules that is governing all these countries. We find that in terms of members and observers of the World Trade Organization, that the amount of countries almost entirely encompass the entire Earth. That's quite good. So you might now ask, what is an observer? An observer is a country who wants to start following the rules of the World Trade Organization and become accustomed to their rules before maybe making an application to become a member. They are not obliged to. You can become an observer and try to follow the rules of the World Trade Organization or become more accustomed to it and then decide, okay, I want to go through this process or not. You are not forced to become an observer before a member. You can apply as a country to become straight a member without being an observer. We also can show that in general, when it comes to the discussions or to World Trade Organization and GATT talks, that increasingly they've become long and complex. When you're dealing with a lot more countries, you expect that. Because of the growth in terms of membership and observers, there's now a lot more countries that you need to negotiate with, and there's a lot more trade issues that might become more apparent. So this has made the meetings of recent times being a bit longer in terms of the amount of months that they have taken. If you look at Uruguay, the talks that happened in Uruguay, and you look at, there was about 120 countries that took place in the talks about trade in Uruguay. You find that that meeting lasted just under 90 months. And the meeting doesn't mean, oh, we're going to sit here for 90 months. It means there's a couple of meetings that they have. So the meeting in Uruguay, they have round 1, they have round 2 discussion, they have round 3 discussion, and round 4 discussion, as many rounds as possible as they can take. And that took approximately 90 months. And if you divide that by 12, you can get some idea of how long the discussions were. That is about just over 7 years, or just under 8 years, or just more than 8 years in that sense. You can do the math. It's important to understand that it's becoming more and more difficult to appease every member or to handle all the issues that are coming forth from every member. Moving to another organization, the OECD member countries. So this is an organization which formed in 1961. Yes, it was linked to another organization in 1948, but it was formally formed in 1961. And these are mostly developed countries who look at trade policy consultation and aid policy. So they use their riches and are being more established to do some work in terms of policy in both aid and in terms of trade. And we find that not a lot of members actually belong to it. It's only a few countries that belong to it. I think roughly just over 20 countries, if I'm not mistaken. The next organization that we're looking at is the United Nations, formed in 1945 and is located in New York. And almost every country belongs to them. They also deal with everything to do with human life and organizations. That's what they're about. They have lots of programs and funds that's in place. So this allows them to look at all these aspects of human life and organization. They have lots of commissions that are in place, and these commissions are tasked at looking at development, human rights, and the status of women, amongst various other things that are deemed important. And then they also have regional commissions that look at the state of Africa, Europe, and Caribbean. And that's all in terms of the trade in those countries, the value of life, and all other aspects of human life and organization inside those regions. There are also a lot of other specialized agencies like the International Labour Organization, the World Bank, and IMF. These are independent organizations, but they have working relationships with the United Nations. And the United Nations will also did some discovery and some look into the least developed countries, that's the LDCs. So LDCs felt very much like trade at that time in the 1950s, 1960s was against them, that they weren't getting any favorable trade, and most of the good trade was occurring for the developed countries. So in 1964, in a UN conference on trade and development, that was, in a sense, this program that was put in place. Actually, when you go and explore how true this was trade being more in favor of the developed countries? So when you go look at that idea, and they found that in general, there is not a lot of proof for this. So what they felt from the least developed countries is that the terms of trade was favoring the countries that they were trading with. So these poor countries or these developing countries felt like, okay, every good that I'm selling, that over time I need to sell a lot more and a lot more and a lot more of this good to be competitive or to allow me to buy all these imports that is coming in over time. So in a sense, what they were feeling is the price of the foreign goods or the price of foreign products were actually improving over time, while the price of their goods was actually relatively not improving over time. So they feel they were losing out. And with a bit of research is done, they showed that there is very limited empirical support for this. So some people obviously will say, well, maybe this report was biased, and then you can look into that discussion, right? But the idea that you need to get from here is that that is not actually true based on the report that was done by the United Nations, and that the least developed countries weren't actually being not favored, that it was actually a very equal footing that was occurring. Only thing is here, when we're talking about the terms of trade, we are talking about the trade of primary goods for manufactured goods. And least developed countries usually produce primary goods. while the countries that they're trading with, which is usually the developed countries, are producing manufactured goods. So they were feeling that they needed to trade more and more primary goods in order to actually compete or to come on par with these developed countries trading in terms of manufacturing goods. Also, there was also a look into tariff escalation, and they found that in general, the tariffs on processed goods were a lot more higher, and that on materials were lower. So what does that mean for these developed countries? What are the countries that are having the processed goods, the manufactured goods? Those are mostly the developed goods. So these, not developed goods, the manufactured goods. So these manufactured goods are now getting the higher tariffs. What is that doing? Making the product a lot more expensive for a least developed country to purchase. And what's happening for the least developed country? What are they doing usually? What are they selling usually? They're selling usually primary goods, or they're usually selling the resources that are needed to produce these manufactured goods. So when they sell the materials, their tariffs aren't really actually high. The industry is then not allowed for their growth in a sense because they can't protect the industry. The tariffs are low, they're not really getting a lot for this product, and they are losing a lot more out in terms of the production process. They're losing at the bottom scale where they're providing the resources, which now turns into a manufacturing good, and then now they're forced to pay very expensive price to get the same good which they actually provided the resource for. So this is the type of issues that we find that the least developed countries were complaining about. And they were also against the idea of non-discrimination. They didn't want to follow the non-discrimination thing. This was in the 1950s and 1960s, and they wanted some favorable treatment. And we know that actually now, in terms of the GATT rules, and that there are exceptions for developing countries. I'm pretty sure that it's just not the idea that, oh, I'm a developed country, I get the concession. There must be some process for you to get this concession or this relief of having to follow the trade rules that are in place. And also from this type of study at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development looked into was the idea that where is growth actually happening, where is trade mainly taking place, in which form is trade taking place, in which form is trade taking place mainly. And they found that it's mostly been in the form of multinational and in terms of the world investments. So those are the two types of aspects where trade is the most important, looking in terms of world investment and looking in terms of multinational growth. Having set up all these organizations, we're going to look at economic transition. What is the impact that all these organizations have had in terms of a country going through some economic transition? We're going to be focusing on the Central and Eastern European region. And our approach is going to be of a form of a multi-dimensional trajectory. And there are two dimensions that we're going to be focusing on. The first thing is the state of ownership, and the second idea is market intervention. So when we're dealing with state ownership, we're dealing with the idea of government-owned and private-owned, or combination between the two. And then the second idea is looking at market intervention. What is government doing? Are they interacting in the market, or they're not participating in the market at all? The economic transition which we're going to be looking at for these regions are going to be in terms of a matrix. We're going to have two types of dimensions that we mentioned earlier. The x-axis is going to represent market intervention, which ranges from 0 market intervention to 100% market intervention. And then we're going to have the y-axis representing state ownership, which runs from 0 state ownership to 100% state ownership. So those are axes that we're going to look at in terms of our dimensions and in terms of our matrix. And we're going to have different economic systems, and we're going to characterize them in this matrix. The first comparison is going to be between capitalism and communism. When capitalism is in place, we're dealing with no state ownership. Everything is owned by private firms, and we're also dealing without any market intervention. So government is not doing anything. Everything is owned by the private firms, and there's no interaction by government at all. So that's going to be at the bottom left of the matrix. That is where capitalism is going to be. Communism is a bit of a different thing. Communism is the idea that everything is owned by the state. So we have 100% state ownership, and everything is then also controlled by the state. So the market intervention is also at 100%. So that is going to be represented on the top right hand corner of our matrix. So in a sense, capitalism and communism are almost exact opposites of each other. They are on opposite spectrums of the matrix. One having no state ownership and no market intervention, that is the capitalism, and then the other having 100% state ownership and 100% market intervention. Or you can just say they have state ownership and they have market intervention. That is your communism. What we find that is when we're looking now in terms of countries, we're going to look at the USA, Cuba, and another country. When we try to plot them on this matrix, we're going to find that none of the extremes of capitalism and communism is ever found in any country. What we're going to find is, okay, some countries can have a lot of capitalism, but not 100% capitalism. So they're going to have maybe a bit of state ownership and a bit of market intervention. So that country will be a country like the USA. And then we're going to find countries like North Korea and Cuba, which are seen as communist countries, not having full state ownership. There's still a bit of private ownership, and government is not always acting in the market, but they're having most of the say of what's happening in terms of the market. So there's a lot of market intervention in a sense. So we can find that USA, North Korea, and Cuba actually making efforts to change the type of state ownership and market intervention that's occurring for these countries. And this is what we're looking in terms of transition. So we're going to look at it from terms of Cuba. Cuba can either move towards market socialism, or they can move towards a welfare state capitalism. So they have multiple paths that they can move towards, right? They can also obviously move from market socialism towards capitalism, right? That's the pathway that is probably most people want him to do or to move to, but they can move in terms of stages, right? They can first move maybe from communism to market socialism. So that's the idea that, okay, we have all resources still owned by the state, but we're going to allow the market to operate freely. Demand and supply is going to be the only factors that's going to cause what the prices are in terms of the market. We're not going to have any government intervention. And that's quite difficult to do. If you're owning all the resources and the market's not really doing well, and you're not interacting in the market, you're going to hurt your assets and companies that are state-owned. Okay, but maybe that's a good thing, right? Maybe that forces prices to be a certain amount. Anyways, Cuba can also move to becoming a wealthy state. So that's the idea, okay, we're going to still have full market intervention. Us as a country, the government is still going to make all intervention once possible, but we're not going to own any of the companies. The companies are going to be owned privately. Right? And that is called a welfare state capitalism. So Cuba can move to 3 different things. Yes, at the same time, it can move in between, somewhere in between all these different type of paths that exist, or these type of states that exist. And that's ultimately up to what the thinking is by government, by the private owners in these companies, and whatever agreements that they can come to. So, yeah. So that's something you need to consider when you're looking at economic transitions. Is just the idea of, oh, what is the state ownership? What is the market intervention? Can we move to other state ownership? Can we move to other market intervention? So when you look at economic transition at least looks at two dimensions. For our example, we just looked at state ownership and market intervention. And there are other aspects that we can also look at and other dimensions that we can consider. But economic transition is a multi-dimensional type of look of moving a country from one state to another state. Unfortunately, if we look at other concepts like privatization, then it's actually a one-dimensional thing. It's only looking at economic transition in terms of state ownership. So it's a one-dimensional look. And that's just the idea of moving from where government owns everything to where firms own everything. Where government sells all the assets to firms. Having discussed economic transitions, we can look at the economic systems that exist around the world. And we just have a map here to show the variations between capitalism and communism. So these are your economic systems that are in place by various countries. Economic transitions are not easy. There are various steps that you need to take in order to make the economic transition successful. So you have to look at it from an institutional point of view. You need to look at it from a micro and a macro point of view. And you also have to do various adjustments in terms of your capital, your services, and labor. You need to be able to reallocate that to sectors that will need it and to allow for the economic transition. Obviously, when you're doing these changes, you can expect that production is going to actually decline. So it's not something that's going to be immediately successful. You need to think about this long term. And there are some negatives that occur initially. There are two approaches you can take. You can take the Big Bang approach or you can take the gradual approach. It's exactly what it says. Big Bang approach, you're trying to implement all the steps of your transitions in a very short period of time. You're trying to do everything basically almost at once. So what happens then if you're going to do that, you're going to expect that your production is going to decrease quite a bit. And Poland is quite an example for this. So you look at Poland's type of approach in terms of having the economic transitions that would best fit the Big Bang approach. In terms of the gradual approach, you're trying to do this systematically. You're looking at this as a sequence of steps. I do this first, follow it with this. And you usually then put in place so you don't feel the impact of your output loss in one go. So you feel it slowly. And that maybe makes it a bit easier for your country to handle. And if you look at a country that was very successful at that, and you can look at it in terms of the Soviet Union. They used a very gradual approach as opposed to Poland, which used a very Big Bang approach. So you need to be able to make this formal discussion when you're talking about economic transition, where economic transition considers multiple dimensions. It's not so easy in these dimensions of where you want to move because it considers various factors that you need to look at from. You need to look at from institutional, micro, macro. You need to be able to say that even when you look at from these aspects, there's a lot of reallocation of resources that needs to occur. And at the same time, it's not rosy at the beginning. There's some production loss. And you can look at this production loss maybe in terms of two strategies. You can take the loss all in one go, or you can take the losses in small steps over time. If we now compare the economic transition between a big bang country like Poland and a gradualism approach country like Ukraine and Russia, we find that it doesn't actually look the same than what it was on paper. On paper, you expect the loss of Poland to be quite significant or bigger than Russia and Ukraine. And if we look from 1990 to 1991, we find that Poland's loss was not actually much bigger than Russia and then Ukraine. And its growth there afterwards in terms of GDP was actually quite significant. So this might be planning stuff. This might be the idea that, okay, Poland did everything in one go. That was the idea. They took their losses for about 4 years in terms of GDP, and then they had massive growth afterwards. So maybe that's the idea. We take all our losses now, guess what? We're already in it. We can now shape our economy exactly how we want it in the shortest amount of time. Well, Romania, Russia, Ukraine, or Slovakia, which are more the gradualism approach, okay, let's do this piece by piece, but we'll expect little losses, and then our growth will be quite significant or quite stable in a sense. But they didn't actually recover as much as Poland. That was the first problem, right? And with the type of system they put in place, and this is just my opinion, right? That when you're doing a step-by-step sequence approach, that every maybe 2 years or a year or 3 years, you're making the small changes to get you to the place you want to be economically, you might actually lose track. At that place 2 years, you feel something else is important, and then you change what your plan was, and that could be very detrimental for your country. So you could say from this, maybe a gradualism approach is not as good as a Big Bang approach, and it's all up to how these countries reason which approach they wanted to go for. But that's just for you to look at here empirically. There has been growth from these countries from about 2000 upwards for all the countries we listed here, which is not too bad. Obviously, you know that little fall there from 2009. You all know what was that period, 2008, 2009, in terms of the depression that occurred then. But yeah, it's something you need to consider here, that maybe it's better to actually apply a Big Bang approach. Maybe put all your eggs in one basket in a sense. But I mean, it would be actually interesting to you see all the economic transitions of various countries and just not these 5 countries. And there could be a massive difference for other countries that had tried the Big Bang approach and they actually fell apart. And that would give a better idea if we looked at now trying to average the Big Bang effects or Big Bang approaches, their gains in GDP, and then comparing it to the average of all those that applied a gradualism approach. If we look in terms of South Africa, as an example, they're a member of the World Trade Organization and a member of the United Nations. They joined the World Trade Organization during the Uruguay rounds. They followed very much trade liberalization from the end of apartheid, which was just trying to simplify the tariff regime that was in place and by decreasing the tariff rates. And they've always tried to consider the idea, okay, we're going to have a moderately protected economy against our competitors. We're going to keep our average bound on agricultural products at about 20.9%. And they also experienced that their most favored nation rates have declined from 15% in 1997 to 8.7% in 2001. And it just, for example, in terms of South Africa, generally speaking, after apartheid ended, exports and imports increased over time. Although there's a slight blimp between 2008 and 2010 due to the financial crisis, you should also understand that imports has relatively increased more than exports over that same period after apartheid ended. Prior to that, we find that imports and exports was quite stable in a sense, wasn't really growing, but that is generally because most of the world closed off itself against South Africa. Finally, some concluding remarks. Multilateral agencies played a big role in shaping world trade, especially after the Great Depression and after World War II. We also looked at the WTO and GATT, and we looked at the key principles of non-discrimination, reciprocity, and prohibition of trade restriction other than tariffs. We looked at those concepts. And if you remember, non-discrimination was the idea that whenever you put in place a favor towards another country, you need to give that favor to all other countries. And then we did the idea of reciprocity, and that was the idea if I give you some relief on your trade protection or some relief on a tariff, then I would expect the same thing back from you and from other countries, give and take in a sense. And then the idea of prohibition of trade restriction other than tariffs, that's the idea that we try only to have tariffs as the form of trade protection that we put in place. All other types of trade restrictions, we don't want them in place because it's easier to govern tariffs and to observe it than the other form of trade restrictions. And then we looked at other organizations. We looked at the OECD, the UN, UNCDAD. We looked at those organizations, and then we looked at economic transitions. And that economic transitions considers multiple dimensions, and you can either approach it in terms of a Big Bang approach or in terms of a gradualism approach. That's it for class. See you next week.